Good morning, everybody. Very nice of them to leave me 3 glasses of water. You haven't touched it, have you? Thanks, Howard. Not much left for me to say, really. I'll just ask my management team to stand up for a moment. Everybody knows who they are. I won't introduce them. Most of them well known. Thank you. Howard talked about our financial performance, and we're certainly pretty pleased with that result for our shareholders. But our customers measure us by our reliability, basically how often the power goes off. And a little bit of jargon, we measure that in system minutes. System minutes about Hamilton going off for 40 minutes, so we're on the news if that happens. Last year we lost a total of 7.6 system minutes, customers off basically, and that was our best performance for, as you can see, for many years. So there's a challenge, guys. Have to be better next year. We're getting there. Put another way, if we look at the major outages, which we count as over 0.05 system minutes, we had, I think, a total of 12. SCI target was 21. Once again, the best for nearly a decade. I'll talk a little more about that later. And, you know, we did have our challenges last year. We got a fair bit of weather. For example, those of you who live in Wellington, that South Island snowstorm, which sort of replicated Wahine-like winds around here, gave us a fair crack, but we did not cause any loss of supply to our customers. And I'm not sure if we have the video clip. This was the morning after in the hills behind Wellington. You can see the line swinging. It's a bit jittery actually because the lineman who was up there taking the shot was running backwards rather fast. You can imagine what it was like overnight when the wind was over 100 knots. But we had guys out there and we're pretty proud that we didn't lose any supply. That improvement in reliability didn't come easily. I mean, some of it's because of the reinvestment program and sharpening up our assets, without a doubt. But a lot of it is just our operations, sort of day by day, minute by minute, how we operate the grid and focus on it, and particularly Garth Dibley and his team. We'll talk some more. We've still got a way to go. And, yesterday, fortunately not in Wellington, we actually had 2 major events across the day, which we'll be looking at because that only leaves them about another 6 for the rest of the year. But first, the balance of last year before I talk about how we're going to lift that game further. And as Mark noted, we can now see the end of our sort of mega projects, the 3 mega projects, 2 commissioned during the year, and the Auckland reinforcement will be finished by Christmas. They were pretty big projects, each with their own uncertainties and challenges. And if you'd come up to me 3 or 4 years ago and said we'd be in the position we are now, I would have frankly said you were dreaming. And we have had challenges. The HVDC was about a year late from what, in retrospect, was a pretty ambitious program. But it's going, and the balance of the work on Pole 2, etc., will be done by Christmas, and importantly, will be under budget. The Waikato line always looked difficult, and most of all we had 313 landowners with whom we had to negotiate easements, and any one of them could have stalled the project. But we finished the project on time and in good faith with those landowners who, of course, we have to live with for the next 50 or 60 years. As Mark alluded to, we did run over budget, 70 million over the limit put down by the EC. That's about just a little under 9%, I think. The increase was actually all on the overhead line portion, which makes up about half the total allowance of 824 million. And it was all from flow-on effects from difficult land access, just not being able to get on the land. The Auckland project, the ring round Auckland's had different challenges, particularly traffic. But also we had one underperforming contractor. But it will be finished by Christmas, and that is actually 6 months ahead of what we committed when we did the regulatory case, and it will be well under budget. So, looking back, we'd always do things differently.
and the increase on the Waikato line was disappointing. But you look overall, as Mark said, the allowance on those 3 projects was 1.9 billion, and our total expenditure across the 3 projects, when we wrap them up by Christmas, will be at least 5% below that in aggregate. It's not a bad outcome, really. For the balance of our expenditure last year, as Howard alluded to, we did pretty well. We actually spent more than planned on our internal or departmental expenditure, but that was a conscious decision to continue rebuilding our engineering capability, which had been severely depleted a decade ago. We look at it, we spend over 300 million a year on sort of what we call base capex, which is just refurbishment and replacement of aging stuff, and also in gas area just on maintaining the kit. And if you can make small changes and small improvements on that 300 million, you start to get big savings. And it's a very false economy for companies like Transpower to try and make savings on their engineering capability. And we will, we've rebuilt that, and I'm confident going forward that we won't ever sort of deplete it again. So we did actually manage to offset that increased departmental expenditure, reductions in our field maintenance, by basically using that enhanced engineering capability and the people we put in grid performance to find smarter ways of doing things. And we underspent our base capex budget. Some of that was due to resource limitations, and that'll self-correct now the big projects are finishing. But part of that was just more of that efficiency gain, finding ways to do things differently, to defer expenditure, which we're always trying to do, or even to avoid it. So in review, looking back at last year, a pretty satisfying result, financially and operationally. So what's ahead? Well, 2 things dominate planning, really. First of all, demand growth, which is pretty uncertain. And secondly, technology is rapidly enabling customers to take an active part in balancing supply and demand. So let's look at growth first. And this is our view of future growth on the grid. And you can see the range is generally lower than most other forecasters. I mean, the sort of average, but the range and the uncertainty is much higher than anybody else. So our challenge is to not spend any money, that may be stranded if we get that very flat line in the bottom, but then not to be late if we get the growth up towards the top side of that. So that's the trade-off we're trying to play all the time. We're very focused on that. Part of the solution is shortening the build time for projects. So we're spending quite a bit on corridor policy, just acquiring options, early consenting, etc. So we can just do the build faster if we get the higher growth kicking in. But probably the key strategy is to create technology options to get more out of the existing grid, which allows us to delay committing to projects till we absolutely need them. And the system operator and the grid have really been working hand in glove to make those transmission tomorrow technologies real, and importantly for us, to make them robust enough so that we can rely on them, just because of the high demands in sort of accuracy that an electricity grid requires. But we can get a bit carried away with growth and say, well, demand grows flat, Transpower doesn't have to do anything. Grid loading's not actually just about demand growth. A big part of it is about where generators locate. And look, we're always going to need a core grid because we've got this great block of cheap hydro in the South Island, and that's not going anywhere. That's going to be around producing power at virtually nothing for decades. And we've got Auckland growing. So we're always going to need a core grid to move things from south to north. But we can get scenarios developing where overall demand growth falls and load on the grid increases. And 2 obvious examples. We are seeing, probably earlier than forecast, the older thermal plants in the upper part of the North Island actually closing. We've seen one unit at Huntly, etc. And that just shifts generation to the south. So actually we get falling demand and increasing loading on the core grid. And the other obvious option is if Tiwai was ever to reduce demand or go, you know, we've got 600 megawatts in the deep south that somehow has to get to that great monolith up in Greater Auckland where all the growth is.